Our first panel this week deals with rulemaking and aviation safety. Since I'm moderating it, I'm going to step aside as being your host and be your moderator for this next panel. Everyone in this room knows that to be safe and successful as professional aviators, we have to learn and follow a set of rules and procedures. The incredible safety record we now enjoy in our industry is due in no small measure to the body of standards for training, operations, airplane manufacture, airport, and the list goes on. Of course, those rules are not static or constant. They change as our industry changes and evolves. We learn from experience. Sometimes experience can be costly, painful, or tragic, and we must ensure that the disastrous lessons of the past are not repeated. So, over time, our experience leads to more rules. Here's a statistic. In 1945, the U.S. Civil Aviation Regulations contained a mere 25 pages of rules that covered training pilots and operating aircraft. 70 years later, we recognize many of those early concepts are now included in well over 400 pages in today's U.S. FAR Parts 61, 91, and 121, as well as other regulations. You'll also notice that we filled a lot of safety holes in those 70 years. I am confident that the evolution of the rules in Canada and the rest of the international community have been about the same. Most of the time, changes are slow and deliberate, and with good reason. In aviation, just as in all aspects of modern life, making rules is hard. It's supposed to be hard. We need to be sure that we know exactly what we're changing, why, and identifying unintended consequences before we just arbitrarily change something. It's supposed to be responsive. When we find a hole in our safety net, we need to be able to patch it in a hurry. So how do we strike the right balance between keeping the safety bar high while keeping the regulatory revision process nimble at the same time? Making effective rules requires collaboration. As an industry, we have learned that if we involve stakeholders in the process of developing the rules, we get a better product. Collaboration lets us find out early in the process what trade-offs can be made to balance all the competing interests and still get the desired outcome. Even with everybody at the table, though, the process can get very complicated very fast. Now let's talk about cost. In 1997, the White House Commission on Aviation Safety and Security, better known as the Gore Commission, concluded that while cost-benefit analysis is a great tool to help in rulemaking efforts, safety improvement costs should not be used as the only criterion. Safety enhancement gains can be difficult to measure, so being expensive should not automatically disqualify a proposal from consideration. Our operating rules go a long way towards achieving a single high level of safety throughout the world. However, we as pilots know there are places that we fly to that don't necessarily conform to the same standards we're used to. As a result, many of us in this room have devoted a tremendous amount of energy over many years to the task of international harmonization of our safety standards, and a lot of progress has been made in that area. One thing is for sure, the regulatory environment and the international standards frame the safety agenda for those of us doing air safety work. Today, with us today is a very distinguished group of speakers from the international aviation community who are going to give us their views on how to establish the single high level of safety for which we all strive. Like all the other panelists this week, we will give each a brief introduction. You can find more comprehensive bios of all of our speakers in your program booklet. Leading off today, we have Ms. Peggy Gilligan, Associate Administrator for Aviation Safety of the FAA, and then Mr. Martin Eley, Director General of Civil Aviation for Transport Canada. They will share with us their top priorities in the United States and Canada. We'll hear the airline's perspective on North American regulatory landscape from Mr. Tom Hendricks. Currently, Tom serves as Senior Vice President of Safety and Operations at Airlines for America. Then we'll get a global perspective on air safety standards from Mr. Mitchell Fox, the Chief of Flight Operations for ICAO. And finally, our own ALPA First Vice President and National Safety Coordinator, Captain Sean Cassidy, will offer his thoughts on the role of the end user, namely the pilots in the cockpit, in the regulatory process. So let's begin. I'd like to start off with you, Peggy. I'd like to hear from you on the safety priorities you're pursuing at the FAA in today's regulatory environment.
Thank you, Chuck, and thanks to ALPA for asking me to be a part of this panel. I'm actually looking forward to the discussion that we'll be able to get into because I think when we see the interaction and when we understand better what questions you have, we can make the panel perhaps a little more interesting. But I think it's important really to note how the theme of this panel links to the overall theme for the conference. So this panel is talking about one level of safety, and because we're trying to accomplish that, I think it's become clearer to all of us that everything matters. I think it's a fabulous theme for this year's conference because we've gotten to the point where every small thing is something we need to know and understand so that we can better manage the risks within the industry. So let me talk a little bit about some priorities. I think, and I hope all of you know, that the #1 priority for the FAA is to work together with all of our industry partners. And when I say industry, I really do mean everybody involved. I was actually at one of these conferences and used that term quite a bit, and after the panel, someone came to me and said, "You never mentioned labor." Well, for safety, from where I sit, labor is a part of the industry. There may be reasons why labor and management have to take different perspectives on some issues, but that's not the case on safety issues. So you are a key player in our interactions with the aviation industry as we set our safety priorities. And working together, one of our key priorities is to focus on voluntary programs because we've already seen how much benefit those can give us. I know many of you are familiar with the Commercial Aviation Safety Team. Several of us on this panel serve on that team. And ALPA has been a key player in the success of the Commercial Aviation Safety Team from its inception. You've been very well represented. And now as we've also created the Aviation Safety Information and Sharing System, ALPA has been a key player in that initiative as well. And it is because we understand the perspective that labor brings to those discussions that the voluntary programs have gotten stronger over time. So those will continue to be one of our key initiatives. Through the safety sharing program, the information sharing program, we've brought together data from almost all of the airlines, but covering probably over 90% of the operations in the US. Both through the individual reporting programs of ASAP as well as through FOCO programs. But we've merged that with a lot of data that FAA has through the air traffic system and a lot of other aviation data systems that are available that gives us a much fuller picture of the kinds of risks that remain in the system so that we can identify safety enhancements that can address those. Those programs, along with AQP, another voluntary program, will continue to be key focus areas for FAA as we work with the industry to continue to strive toward one level of safety. And again, these are 3 programs that really show how everything matters. So in the AQP program, we're collecting data, we're analyzing the effectiveness of training, able to better understand where and how to make improvements to the training program so as to continue to strive toward a single level of safety. Today, 75% of the 121 carriers are using or have begun to introduce AQP programs. And we think that that's a very important step forward to raising the level of training that we see throughout the system. And again, we really appreciate ALPA's strong support of programs like AQP that continue to enhance both the pilots' training and capabilities, but more importantly, really help us improve safety. Our regulatory priorities are a little more complicated. I think as many of you know, through congressional action, both in the summer of 2010 and more recently in the FAA reauthorization bill, we've gotten a tremendous number of directions on regulatory initiatives, and we have a number of those underway. Under the original safety bill, of course, we've already completed the work on the flight duty and rest rule, and we're continuing to push forward on a number of the other initiatives that were called out in that particular legislation. I think we are struggling, and I think actually Chuck touched on some of it in his opening remarks. So I'll talk a little bit about cost benefit and the analysis we go through. But let me highlight a couple of the key priorities that we're really working hard on. And the first one for us is the requirement to put in place the safety management systems at all Part 121 carriers. I think all of us are familiar with and understand sort of intellectually how moving toward a safety management system is really going to help move our safety bar that much higher. But I have to tell you, it's pretty complicated to figure out exactly how to implement one of those kinds of programs, and more importantly, how to describe in rules what the elements of that program need to be and how to go about doing it. The dilemma that we run into oftentimes as we go into rulemaking is as you try to describe or to articulate exactly what the regulation requires, it sets parameters. So it sets what's required, and for some that means whatever's not set there isn't required. Or in fact, if I try to do something more, maybe I'll end up contrary to what the rule wanted. And so what we're trying to do hard through our pilot programs, and I know many of you are employed by companies that are part of our pilot programs, we're really trying to see in action, what is it that a safety management system needs to encompass? So when we set the language in our rule, we haven't had an unintended consequence of leaving something out or being overly broad or being too narrow. So we're learning a lot from the pilot programs, and we are a little bit behind on the schedule that Congress set for us for that final rule. But I can assure you that the SMS rule is one of our very top priorities, not just because the Congress directed it, but because we know, and you know, safety management systems are really the future for aviation safety. Let me touch a little bit on the cost-benefit issue. It is true that we are required by both statute and by presidential executive order to consider the costs and the benefits to society of any standard that we set. It's not unique to FAA or aviation. It's a requirement for all rulemaking organizations. And we are not required to show that the costs are less than the benefits. We are required to show that the costs are justified in relation to the benefits that the public will receive. The dilemma that we face in aviation is because we've made it so safe, we are not very often now faced with solving a past failure, where sometimes it's very easy to show that failure costs society a huge number of dollars. What we're trying to do, and SMS and FOQA and all the voluntary programs will help us, what we're trying to do is identify the risk before it manifests itself as catastrophic failure, and to anticipate what the benefit would be if we can prevent it. And the dilemma is that that approach is not consistent with the way the process for rulemaking is written. And so we're really struggling with being able to demonstrate that even though that bad thing hasn't happened yet, if it were to happen, it would likely cause this kind of cost, and investing in preventing that cost is worth it to society. We're having very pointed and difficult conversations within the administration quite often on these kinds of concepts and issues. But I do think that we will be successful in many of the areas and be able to continue to move the safety bar because we can demonstrate that the cost is justified by the benefit that we might see. Let me talk for a minute on flight duty and rest in that context. I know many of you are troubled by the reality that or by the fact that we had to draw some lines in finalizing that rule. And at this point, the rule does not include pilots who fly cargo, all cargo operations. It was a difficult decision throughout the administration. But I think at the end, we and everyone involved in the discussions came to the conclusion that we could, in fact, properly justify the investment that would need to be made to affect the passenger carrying flights. You'll hear the administrator later in your conference, but I can assure you that he and the secretary continue to work quite hard at raising the issue with the cargo operators to consider, to look at the science that informed the rules that we set for passenger carrying operations, and to consider those principles as they look at their own schedules. An important piece, I think, that made it, that allowed us to come to that ultimate conclusion was that we do have a requirement in the statute, and it affects cargo operators, that they must have the flight fatigue risk management plans. So we are working with the cargo operators to make sure that they are looking at the scientific principles that underlie the passenger carrying rule to make sure that as they do their fatigue risk management plans, that they are looking at those same concepts. Let me just touch for a minute on NextGen, which is obviously a key priority for the FAA, but it's also a key priority in our accomplishing one level of safety. I think what we see within the FAA is that the NextGen system causes the aircraft to become really the center of the system, which my friends in air traffic, I hope I'm not offending them, we've always thought the aircraft was the center of the system. I like to regularly remind air traffic they'd have nothing to control if we didn't let them into the system. So, I mean, it really is important that we understand the kinds of technology that the aircraft is able to take with it wherever it goes. And that means it's taking its safety infrastructure with it when it goes to parts of the world that will never have the ground-based infrastructure that Canada and the US are able to provide, for example, or Europe provides. So operations into Africa, Latin America, throughout Asia can have the same level of safety that we can experience in the more developed markets, because the aircraft can bring a number of those safety systems with it and reduce that risk. So that's another one of our key initiatives. But in closing, I think what's important for all of us to keep in mind is we can't accomplish any of this if we aren't always working together, if we aren't always understanding what are the risks that are still in the system and identifying ways that we can mitigate those risks voluntarily, hopefully, and if necessary, by regulation. So I look forward to the conversation with you and with the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Peggy. Let's turn now to Canada and hear from Transport Canada on what their priorities are in the regulatory environment they are in. Martin?
Yeah, thank you, Chuck. Thank you for the opportunity to come. I was here 3 years ago, so part of what I do is a little update on where we are, and the opportunity to come and perhaps share some of the Canadian experience and perspective. I would like to acknowledge a lot of what you do involves Canadian members, so it is very much an international organization. I was just thinking as we talked this morning, the theme of the conference, everything matters, and I fully support that. I was also looking at it in the context of risk-based decision-making that we were hearing in security this morning, and I think the conclusion of my own mind is in a risk-based world, you know, you make a conscious decision not to do some of the things that are at the lower end of the risk spectrum, but you're dealing with them by not making a decision as opposed to just not doing them. So I don't think the two things are impossible to reconcile, but everything does matter, but sometimes you have to make a decision you can't do it all. So anyway, I just offer that as an interaction between the two. Just a little bit of background. Our accident rate continues to, the absolute accident, the number of accidents continues to drop. Despite the increase in traffic, the accident rate continues to drop. So, you know, as with North America as a whole, the US particularly, we have a strong record, but that doesn't mean we can sit back. You know, we're challenged, as Peggy says, to get into some of the things which are harder to justify, but doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. It's very clear that the associations such as ALPA have a very strong role to play. We talk about collaboration. The regulator can't do it all. Sitting back and writing a regulation doesn't mean very much if it's taken out of context. Engaging the associations, having them engage members. And one of the things that I often get in discussion about is the association's role. A lot of the time their role is to lobby government, but at the same time it's also to make sure their membership understand the needs of government, and that two directions. So, you know, getting associations to take on responsibility, understanding our approach, helping educate their members is equally important in my view. There's no question that as an organization, ALPA is very strategic, and I think that plays hugely into the safety record. Associations, a lot of them tend to be issues-based. We don't always get that strategic perspective, so it is very valuable where we do see it. In terms of moving forward, there's no question continuous improvement. The word that hasn't come up this morning, but a fundamental to a lot of this is quality assurance. I know within the FAA they've done a lot of work on quality assurance. A lot of the operations that we have as we move forward with SMS, we don't always have the quality assurance regulations in place. So it's very hard to introduce a continuous improvement philosophy when in fact people are not used to using quality assurance. So finding ways to build that in as part of SMS is a key piece of the puzzle. What we have done is we've undergone a lot of change in the last few years, and I just want to talk a little bit about that. Internally, we've gone through a major reorganization. We realized that if we were going to be successful in an SMS or a systems-based approach to life, we also need to deal with companies at an enterprise level. So we completely reorganized both our rulemaking, so it was done in one place, so it wasn't focused on particular technical disciplines, but also at the delivery level, making sure we could deal with a company. If you have an SMS, typically it's the whole company. It's not an operating certificate on the flight or the maintenance side. Those things need to come together. So we felt the need to completely rebuild the organization. That's always an opportunity in the sense of trying to correct some of the things that maybe in the past you haven't got right. It's also a huge challenge, both in terms of defining the work, keeping the work going in process, but also making sure we look after people and treat them fairly. We do believe we've made a lot of progress. We're expecting the majority of that work to be finished by the end of this fiscal year, which is the end of March for us. It has taken a long time, but that's partly because we rebuilt it. We didn't really move the boxes around. We've completely restructured it. Within that, again, a lot of managing risk is part of the way we do business, and we have to factor that into, both internally as well as dealing with the external risk, the way we do our own work. From an external point of view, we continue down the road of implementing SMS. We've come a long way, which also means that we've learned a great deal. And clearly SMS is what we expect the industry to do, where a lot of the work is also looking at our own surveillance program to make sure that our role in respect of SMS is clear. How do we operate as a regulator? And more recently, there's been some initiatives to actually look at the enforcement side of what we do, and how do you deal with that in a systems-based approach? So we're trying very hard to bring all these things together. We think we're getting towards some sort of closure, ultimately looking for stability in the organization and the program. We did put a hold in 2009 on moving forward SMS in some areas. We got a lot of feedback that the industry wasn't necessarily ready. Our employees weren't necessarily all at the point where they were comfortable. What we're just in the process of doing is essentially doing a risk assessment of moving forward. What are the things we need to put in place to make it right to move forward? There's no question the principles of SMS, we believe, apply in every area. But it's also very clear that how you apply that to a mom and pop type flight training unit is very different to the way you apply it to a major airline. So in some cases, whether we will go to SMS or whether we will just apply some of the principles in a different way, that's exactly the work that we're hoping to do in the next few months so we have a plan on how we move forward. Today, SMS covers all the major carriers, airports. NAV Canada is a huge part of the system, and what we're seeing is the companies that do understand it, who get it, who move into the culture, they see the benefits from that from a safety and an operational point of view. We continue to be convinced that it is the right direction to go. One of the things that we did introduce this year, which is a new tool, but we're very excited about, is a risk profiling tool, where we look at risk indicators, looking at a company, looking at changes in the company, change in staff, expansion of the fleet, expansion of the route structure, basically generating a standardized risk profile across the country through a centralized program that helps us see the relative risk both within a region, between regions, between types of certificate holders. So that gives us a much better ability to be more consistent on our risk. In the past, we were dealing with a lot of those things locally. We've yet to see whether it works perfectly, because we haven't been through the cycle yet. But at this point, we have a lot of sense, and it's certainly something we'd be happy to share as we move forward. At the same time, we're trying very hard to be proactive, working with companies. We can't lose sight of the fact that when you need to take enforcement action, you need to do that consistently. So be very clear, developing our own protocol, but also being clear with the industry. We want to give you credit for what you do, but if people take deliberate steps to avoid the regulations, we also need to be quick to deal with that. The next piece I want to touch on was just our regulatory piece. We've had KRAC for close to 20 years, our consultative process. I would say on the one hand, it's been very effective, from the consultation point of view. It hasn't necessarily become efficient in terms of the processes. Working groups tend to take a life on a life of their own sometimes, in the sense it's hard to draw to conclusions. In terms of the dialogue, the paperwork. So we're undergoing a process of trying to try and maintain that consultation, but at the same time make it more nimble, respond. And we see that there's a lot of technology and social media perhaps we can use today that will help us to have the engagement, but in a much more flexible and dynamic way. We had some pressure in recent times. We had a couple of TSB reports on particular accidents where there was a need to work quickly. So we took these as an opportunity to look at how we do things on the rulemaking side. and see, is there a way to approach things? So rather than set up a working group that we felt was going to take a long time, we ended up, in each case, establishing a focus group. And this was really to get a number of people, by invitation on both the industry and the regulator side, into the room to go through the issue. The two accidents, so you're probably familiar. One was the Cougar helicopter accident on the east coast of Canada. It was an offshore helicopter operation, but when you're talking about 19 passengers, you're really in the same sort of league as we talk about in the smaller airlines. The second one was on a float plane accident we had on the west coast. And one of the things that is not unique to Canada, but certainly dominates, is we probably have the world's largest commercial float plane operation in terms of the numbers. So when we talk about one level of safety, how do we do that for things like offshore float plane operations? How do you compare that with the major airlines again? So yes, that's clearly one to go. The cost of doing that can be very different. We need to find ways to differentiate while achieving a reasonable level of safety. Part of the reason for being here today is to foster that collaborative piece with ALPA and other organizations and with the FAA, MSA. We have a lot of interaction, not necessarily always at my level, but there's a lot of contact between the two organizations. And I think that helps us both a lot along the way. The focus group that I mentioned, just to get back to the rulemaking process, we see that as a lead-in to the rulemaking. And what we plan to do is to, at the end of a focus group, is to identify what we're going to be doing. The flexibility that we see is we're not necessarily talking about an NPA, our equivalent an NPRM, but quite often out of an industry focus or combined transport industry focus group, we find that industry best practices can be introduced very quickly while we take the time to do rule making. Maybe guidance material in the short term is more effective as an intermediary step. So having a whole spectrum of tools, we find that way we can have that discussion, bring those together as a package in a way that we didn't always do very well when we did the rule first and then the guidance and moved into the industry afterwards. So as we get into the process, there's a lot to be done to improve the process itself. But getting off to a quick, effective start really does make a big difference. And I think I've covered most of the points. I think from our point of view, the proactive piece, Peggy mentioned this word, it really is, that's where we have to move forward. It's sometimes harder to justice, but it's seeing things coming, doing our best to anticipate and avoid problems rather than trying to react. There will always be a reaction. I don't think we'll ever get to zero accidents. It's clearly the goal, but there will always be something that we need to fix in some area. So I think I'll wrap up there just by saying increased collaboration. We have a lot today. We have to keep going in all directions, and that is a key piece. And it's back to communications is typically the strongest piece in all of that. So thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to our discussion today.
Thank you, Martin. Very, very interesting. Let's change gears just for a little bit here and turn it over to one of our other, one of our industry stakeholders, and that's the airlines. Let's get the airlines' perspective on the environment, the regulatory revision environment right now, and that process and setting priorities. Tom?
Thank you, Chuck, and good morning, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to provide the airlines' view of aviation safety. As you all are aware, we are enjoying a period of extraordinary safety performance in the U.S. airline industry, and this did not just happen by chance. Over the last 2 decades, we've changed our view of safety, how we manage risk, how we collaborate amongst different stakeholders, and our performance is a model for the world. And as I said earlier, this did not just happen by chance. It's taken the cooperation of employees, of airlines themselves, of manufacturers, of labor groups, of our regulators, and we've worked very diligently to identify the risks using data-driven approaches and to start to manage that very deliberately. Peggy and her organization at the FAA has provided a lot of leadership in this regard. I also serve on the commercial aviation safety team and the aviation safety information analysis and sharing system, which is a mouthful. But these are very important efforts. We've been able to engage employees and airlines and collect massive amounts of data, de-identify that data, and do some really high-level, deep analysis on where the risks lie. One of the discussions 20 years ago we were having tended to be binary. An operation was either safe or unsafe. Now our system is extraordinarily safe. We'll never win safety. We'll always fight to improve our safety performance. But we're now able to talk more about how we manage risk. And I would offer that the U.S. airline industry is a model for the world in how we manage risk. Let me give you an example of that. As a retired airline captain, I've had the opportunity to fly Boeing aircraft into Kansas City and into Quito, Ecuador. And I can tell you that the safety of those flights are both very solid at a very high level, but the challenges we face in those different operating environments are completely different. Anyone that's flown into the Andes region in South America will tell you that the set of risks are just different than flying into the heartland of America, if you will. And the airlines, working with our regulators, with our inspectors, are very deliberately managing this risk on a daily basis, on a flight-by-flight basis, and I think we are a model for many other industries. In fact, other industries are seeking out expertise in the airlines to have discussions about how we manage risk. So it's been not one person, not one party, it's been the entire culture of aviation improving, continually looking for additional data to do deep analysis on how we manage this risk. We help set the policy framework here in Washington, but it's the employees out in the field, it's the inspectors out in the field that have enjoyed this change of culture where they're able to provide us with these voluntarily provided set of data that we can analyze in a more thorough basis. And frankly, we're onto something. It's working very well. Again, we'll never declare that we've conquered safety. We'll always strive to get better. But the methods we're using now are highly effective. They're very deliberate. They're very measurable. And it's taken the cooperation of everyone on this panel, including ALPA and other labor organizations, to be able to achieve that. So I would offer that we should always have deliberate and frank discussions about new regulations. We're certainly pretty good at that. And I think Peggy would agree and everyone up here would agree. But we're in a point now where we've got access to data that we've never had before. We have access to analysis that we've never had before. And our ability to look out into the future and try to predict where these future risks are by looking at the data is extraordinary, and we anticipate it's just going to get better. So U.S. airlines are committed to this. We're partners fully with our employees, with our regulator, with the labor organizations out there, but it's really the people out there, the pilots, the dispatchers, the load planners, the air traffic controllers, the maintenance technicians. Our culture has changed in the U.S. where everyone wants to take the risk out of the system, so we never get to that unsafe situation. We're managing below that level in a very effective manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I think one of the points you brought up is the challenges between flying domestically and flying in the international arena. And I think it's interesting now to get a global perspective, particularly as FAA and Transport Canada work very closely with ICAO in adopting standards developed by ICAO. Let's hear from Mitch and get into some of the processes at ICAO.
Thanks, Chuck. Good morning, everybody. And before I begin my opening remarks, let me just thank the organizing committee for inviting ICAO to participate in your Air Safety Forum. We really appreciate that opportunity. I'd also like to pass on the very best wishes of our Secretary General, Mr. Raymond Benjamin, and my boss, Nancy Graham, for a very successful forum. I think as many of you know, ICAO was an outcome of the Chicago Convention in 1944. In fact, the world at that time, 51 states, actually 52 states, were invited by President Roosevelt to attend the Chicago Convention. There was a realization at that time that technology had gone far enough that international civil aviation would really be a major mover and shaker of the world in the future. President Roosevelt, in his message to the conference, reminded the 52 countries that were present to undertake a task of the highest importance and he urged the conference participants to work together so that air may be used by humanity to serve humanity. So, many years later, there are 191 member countries of ICAO, soon to be 192 member countries. The convention would not be possible, nor would the framework of international civil aviation, if it wasn't for an international collaborative approach among countries, but also the industry. And I'd like to add, I think Peggy's absolutely right. You're a part of that industry. I find it interesting that IALPA, your international voice at ICAO, was formed very soon after the convention in 1944. IALPA was formed in 1948. There was a realization that you have a unique perspective on international civil aviation operations, and that your voice needed to be heard on an international basis in order for us to have that one level of aviation safety because of your perspective. Over the past few years, ICAO has intensified its engagement or reach out to some of the largest regulators of the world and industry. For the first time that I can ever remember in my 21 years with ICAO, we asked the FAA, EASA, and some other major regulators to tell us their view for rulemaking over the next 5 to 10 years. It's only through this that we can ensure the relevancy of our work program at ICAO. However, we're not doing this without due consideration of all of our member states if we're to achieve that one level of safety. In fact, it's those states that struggle so much to implement the international standards that ICAO puts forward into their regulatory framework that gives us a reality check. We're doing the very same thing with industry, including the pilot community. We've reached out to various international organizations to see what their safety and efficiency goals are over the next few years. We need to pull together through a set of harmonized objectives to achieve even higher levels of safety and efficiency. I started my career in the United States as a pilot. I was a line pilot, and like many line pilots, I really didn't know very much about ICAO, and I really didn't know why I should care. It's a fair question, given the very strong role that the FAA and Transport Canada have in your day-to-day operations. The FAA or Transport Canada is your regulator, and you have accountability to them, so let's be clear on that. However, what comes out of ICAO and the ICAO mechanism eventually does have a direct effect on all of you. Let me give you an example. As you know, when you fly into another country's airspace, you have to abide by the rules and regulations of that country. There's an exception to that. If the regulations which govern the issuance of your pilot certificate meet the minimum requirements of the ICAO standards, then it receives an automatic multilateral recognition. In effect, you are one of the exportables in the international civil aviation framework. And this recognition of your certificate supports a system where you are really not required to meet numerous standards or regulations of other countries. You're required to meet those regulations of your country. So what comes out of ICAO in this area and many other areas does have a direct effect on you as a pilot. So let me talk to you a little bit about what ICAO is up to in some areas I think that are most important to you. Peggy mentioned fatigue risk management systems. This is an area where ICAO, thanks to the support of many different countries, the FAA, Transport Canada, the Airline Pilots Association, and many other organizations, as of November 2011, we established new standards for fatigue risk management systems. Those are in place. They're available for use by the 191 member countries of ICAO. Thanks to the support of the pilot community and IATA, we've been able to go around the world and discuss these new standards with the regulators, with the operators, and the pilot community. and we're hoping that these will become of increasing use in the future. I heard the discussion about risk-based approaches. ICAO is increasingly taking a data-driven approach towards its safety programs in a similar manner as CAST in the United States. We've learned a lot of lessons from CAST. We've identified 3 high-priority needs in international civil aviation. These should be no surprise to any of you. They're associated with runway excursions, loss of control in flight, and controlled flight into terrain. Through our cooperation with the FAA and other regulators and the pilot community, we've made advancements in the avoidance of controlled flight into terrain. We have a very active program now in runway safety, including runway incursions and also excursions. We are now advancing our work to address the loss of control in flight. I read a very interesting article this morning that worldwide that may account for up to about 5,000 fatalities over the last 10 years in international civil aviation. I am very pleased and very grateful to see that the FAA has brought its Aviation Rule Committee meetings outside the United States to Montreal, to ICAO. We applaud this wonderful effort and initiative. It allows the international community to benefit from the insights of the ARC process, but also allows for an exchange of best practices on an international basis. From an ICAO perspective, this will go a long way to enable us to work on international training guidance material and prevention strategies, and in the worst case, recovery training from upsets in flight. This is truly a win-win. I expect that this will result in better international guidance on training and possible new international standards that would apply to personnel licensing and operations training. Closely associated with this topic is recurrent training for pilots. We've embarked with industry through IATA with the strong assistance of ALPA on an initiative on how we conduct recurrent simulator training. On an international basis, this may result in a substantial paradigm shift on how we conduct such training. I well recall my own recurrent training checks in the simulator, and regardless of whether that recurrent training check was in the 727 or the A320, they were pretty predictable. The checks were pretty predictable. However, the evidence shows that contributing factors for incidents and accidents have changed significantly with the different generations of airplanes. The notion of what we refer to as evidence-based training is very similar to AQP. Gather the data and structure the training to identified needs. We're working very hard on this approach for both the developed and developing countries, but we are also cognizant that we need your acceptance because you do the training. Many of you may be aware of the existence of the ICAO multi-crew pilot license. This is probably the newest license in ICAO for 40, maybe even 50 years. The approach is complex, yet quite simple. Train the next generation of aviation airline pilots for what they will need to do, define what they'll need to do in measurable and observable terms called competencies. Did we get it right? Well, the jury's still out. Personally, I think we did, but we need the measurements or evidence that we did. We made a commitment to you and the international civil aviation community that we would do a proof of concept, and while we're a little bit late due to resources, we shall do so. We will review the data, and during the fourth quarter of 2013, we'll invite the world to discuss the evidence and best practices in a proof of concept symposium. We look forward to a strong pilot participation. In 2006, ICAO introduced new standards for age limits, the so-called curtailment of privileges, that allows a captain to fly up to age 65. This standard also allows for only in the case that the first officer, of course, is below 60. It also allows for the first officer to fly beyond 60 as long as the captain's below 60. It's the so-called over and under limits. When this new standard was approved, we were also tasked, after 5 years of experience, to review the amendments. We have begun to collect the data from states and international organizations. We've also collected information from research, and we'll finish our analysis fairly soon. There's been a great amount of interest expressed in allowing both crew members to fly past the age of 60. But once again, we'll have to rely on the data and the views of states and international organizations such as IALPA. We're only in the data analysis stage, and until we have the results of this, we will not be in a position to present any new proposals. Something that is very near and dear to my heart is how much fuel we carry on board every flight. Recently, the Council of ICAO has adopted new standards concerning fuel carriage. It's an update to standards that go back as far as 1958. They're more exacting. Now, make no mistake about it, the motivation behind that was efficiency and, of course, the knock-on effects to the environment. But while efficiency was the motivator, the new standards have safety benefits as well. As an integral part to these new standards are well-defined phraseologies that will provide a globally harmonized means to communicate with ATC in the event that priority handling is needed. We're grateful to a number of states that help us to develop these new standards and arrive at global consensus. In particular, we're grateful to the FAA, to IATA, and ALPA that helped us to draft these new standards and the accompanying guidance materials. As most of you know who fly internationally, even from the United States to Canada, the SID-STAR phraseology used for flying or not flying the vertical profile for these procedures varies from one country to the next. This situation opens the door for confusion, and the international aviation community came to ICAO for a solution. We've developed a proposed solution, and this is now with member states and international organizations for consultation. I am aware that this may cause some countries to at least consider changes to their phraseologies that they've been using for quite some time. We are now in the hands of our member countries and international organizations for their opinion on this proposal. Now, I've heard NextGen mentioned several times, and certainly there are safety and efficiency benefits to be realized from NextGen, as there are from SESAR in Europe. We know that these systems will offer great benefits. However, ICAO is actively engaged with the leadership and experts that are developing these systems so that we can achieve a seamless operations. But what about the rest of the world? If we're to achieve one level of safety, if we're to improve efficiency, then we have to do quite a bit of reach out. In this day and age where aircraft can fly nearly halfway around the world, if we don't introduce these new technologies beyond the originating states, we will not fully reap the safety and efficiency benefits. As a result of our work with these programs, we'll be proposing the concept of aviation system block upgrades to the international community in November at the 12th Air Navigation Conference. The block upgrades comprise various operational improvements aimed at harmonizing and improving the efficiency of the global air navigation system. To aid in harmonizing the block upgrades, are supported by roadmaps for comm, nav, and surveillance, as well as information management and avionics. Interestingly, the so-called Block 0 is aimed at best utilizing what you have on most of your modern airplanes today. We look forward to this pivotal meeting for the future of civil aviation, and we're grateful to your technical expertise that will be shared during the meeting through your international association. Ultimately, ICAO is a consensus-building organization, and it's only through our work together that we can advance international civil aviation safety and efficiency in the future. Thank you, Chuck.
Mitchell, thank you very much. Okay, let's hear now from the pilot's perspective. Sean, you and I work a lot on safety issues for this association. Let's have you share with the audience what goes into our strategy and what our priorities are for safety.
Sure. One of the nice things about going last on the panel is if you've seen me out there, I've been kind of scribbling notes and kind of keying on certain things that you said. And first of all, I'd like to thank you for introducing me as a distinguished panelist, which just makes me feel really old. So, every day. But the first thing I kind of keyed on was the term end user. And I hadn't seen any of the remarks that were presented yet. And it's something that I immediately kind of had me riveted on one thing, and that's what's the role of ALPA? What's the role of ALPA in terms of advancing the safety culture, advancing industry safety, because it's really easy to understand what the regulator's role is. With Peggy and Martin on both sides of the border, we have established standards. Sometimes they're prescribed through legislation. Sometimes they come internally because of data-driven reasons, because of high risk factors, which kind of lead us to a certain prescribed requirement for us to go out and fly our airplanes. With Tom, it's easy to understand industry's role because they write our paychecks. They buy the airplanes, they buy the gas, they create payroll, and I'm glad that we have a very good relationship with them, but it's also, again, easy to understand what the role of the industry reps are. It's also easy to understand what the role of the folks who set the standards at the international level, as Mitch assists at the ICAO level with 191 member states at ICAO. They set international standards and recommended practices. So, sometimes we're referred to as industry, sometimes we're referred to as labor, sometimes it's said kind of in a positive light somewhat, and sometimes it's a little bit pejorative. So it's a little bit of a controversial note to kind of start by talking about what we're not, but maybe that'll lead us into what we are. Now, it's been said many times, and it's absolutely true, we're the largest non-governmental safety organization in the world. We have 53,000 members and 37 airlines on both sides of the border, which defines us as the biggest pilot organization in the world as well. We're also the biggest member at the international level at ALPA, which represents 101 member associations in roughly as many states. So one would think that having 53,000 pilots would automatically entitle us to have clout, to give us some kind of organizational inertia. But I'm here to tell you, and at the risk of sounding a little bit off color, size is not all that matters. It's how you use that mass. It's how you kind of deploy it. So how does ALPA fit within the context of these organizations, these distinguished representatives here? I would say that the first thing is that we all recognize, and we saw it on that incredible video this morning, that we are the visceral pulse of the industry. We're the gut check. We're the folks who are out on the front line, who are flying the flights into Juneau, who are flying into Dulles, who have long crew days, challenging situations with weather, with diverts. I was just talking with Tom, as a matter of fact, about a new requirement that just came out at midnight last night, which addresses opposing direction operations, and that directly resulted in a diversion over in my property because of our requirement to make sure we met that new standard while things are getting sorted out. So we have the ability, based upon our experience and the footprint that we have, to give a very good vernacular, very good understanding of what's happening on the front line. The next thing we do very well, which is also why we have organizational influence, is we have superb technical folks. Not only are they out there experiencing all the rigors of life on the line, but they're also raising their hands, like you saw in the video with the 420 folks, and that doesn't even include the local level operators, pilots, and they roll up their sleeves and they get very, very heavily involved in very, very high level technical work. It happens every day. In fact, Tom is going to go down the road to the next subcommittee meeting. I'm involved in that as well. And in order for me to be effective at that level, I need to turn to my experts like Chuck Hogeman, like Mike Shills, like others who can give me very, very good, precise, usable advice on what our position should be, how we should move the ball forward in terms of technical data with, for instance, fuel metrics that demonstrate the effectiveness of next-gen principles and procedures and the fuel savings that we can realize. Without the frontline experience and now combined with the technical activity, we're kind of a rudderless ship. Fortunately, we're very purpose-driven, we're very focused, and I think we're very effective. The other thing that we also do very well is we work very collaboratively in the advocacy role. I've sat on panels with Peggy, I've been with Tom, discussing for instance, the issues of what would happen if we allowed a company to come in that would completely clobber the GPS bandwidth in which all of our satellite-based navigation is incumbent upon. It was high-level advocacy, collaborative work that was able to hit a resonant note with our legislators, with the folks who make key decisions that influence our lives. That is a way in which we seek to, as Lee would say it, as our president would say it, we identify about the 90 to 95% of things we have in common. We combine our purposes, we work together as a team, and we're able to influence either in a positive way by steering rulemaking activity in one direction, or in the case with the GPS thing, heading off something which would have absolutely disastrous and catastrophic implications in the safety world. The next thing that I think we do very well, and again, it speaks to teamwork, is we're very, very strategically focused. Martin, that was something that you brought up about strategic thinking. I think that, saying everything matters is great. Everything does matter, but you also have to have strategic vision and long-term planning and identify what are the things when you're looking at triage, when you're looking at identifying the high-level things that you have to focus on. How do you set the order? How do you prioritize what you're going to work on? Fortunately, we have, the broad context of the one level of safety and security. That's kind of the atmosphere that we work in. But how do you drill down and make effective change in terms of rulemaking activity? I would say one great example that Peggy brought up is SMS. We're at the cusp of having a rule come out which defines, it gives the tools that all of our companies can use, all of our operators can use, all of the maintainers and everybody else that can aggregate, that can take all the amazing amount of data that we have through FOQA and ASAP programs and pilot reports and everything else, and create a tailored, risk-based way of advancing safety that's specific to that airline. It's not a one-size-fits-all. The FAA publishes advisory circulars which say, hey, here's the boilerplate and how you can work internally and how to improve safety, but it's still up for us to work with our partners here to make sure that we're doing it in such a way that it works for that, for that airline. Next gen is another one of those atmospheric terms, and my 33,000-foot definition of next gen is it uses equipage, policies, and procedures to increase the density of air traffic and foot traffic through the airports for that matter, while preserving the same margin of safety or hopefully enhancing it. That's what we're doing right now using what Tom is talking about, and that's data-driven approaches, that's doing risk-based analysis, that's looking at the things that we can do right now to make sure that we can get more dense activity going into these aggregation of airports, otherwise known as metroplex activity, and do so in such a way that we have more widgets, if you will, going through the pipeline without any sacrifice to safety. I come from Alaska Airlines, which is a pioneer in RMP, RNAV-based operations. We're able to take that frontline expertise and bring it right into the policy level realm, where hopefully we're going to start executing on some of the things that the FAA has defined as kind of key portals as part of our next-gen roadmap. And we can even, if I had another 2 hours, I could then jump into unmanned aircraft systems and remotely piloted aircraft because there's an extremely tight timeline that's been directed by the legislature. by September 30th of 2015, we are supposed to be able to have at least the framework established for fully integrated operations where commercial activities and unmanned aircraft will coexist in non-segregated airspace. Incredibly ambitious, very tight timeline. The FAA has set the framework, has set the table with centralizing all the work activity through a joint planning office under a very capable person. But again, it's going to require us to work very, very collaboratively. And I could look around this audience and I could probably pick about 30% of you right now who are already involved in that and probably don't even know it. So, you know, we have the end game, we have the priorities established, we're thinking strategically, we're actually applying kind of risk-based principles even to how we manage that whole cadre of things that falls under the umbrella of what constitutes the work activity when we use the term everything matters. I'll just kind of close on a little bit off base, just like I started. I'm sure everybody has been watching the London Olympics. And for some of the athletes that are in the London Olympics 4 years ago in Beijing, maybe if they fell a little bit short of the mark, maybe if they were, you know, half a second off their interval time or something, they dedicated their next 4 years of their life towards shaving that half a second off the elapsed time for, you know, whatever, you know, in the swimming pool or in the 10K or whatever. They have such an extremely elite level of fitness, they have to push that much harder for the next 4 years to shave a half a second off of their time. I think that's very analogous to what position we're in right now. We have an extremely high level of safety fitness. We have the most safe transportation system in the history of the world over the last 10 years, which just followed the next safest decade in the history of transportation in the world. As Lee would say, that's a very, very high-class problem to have. And as Tom said, we need to keep on pushing forward because just because we're safe doesn't mean we can't be that much safer. It's only through collaborative work, through risk-based approaches to figuring out how we can shave that extra half second off, will we keep on moving that safety bar forward because all the low-hanging fruit's gone. And it's only through the concerted efforts and collaboration and really, you know, this is not eyewash that we're talking about. Every single day, our folks with their industry partners are sitting down with these folks right here and figuring out how we can shave off that last half second. Thank you for coming. Thanks for your interest.
Thank you, Sean. Our work is never done in the safety world, as we all know. So I'd like to now open it up for some questions and answers. You have a fabulous opportunity here to talk to certainly the regulators here in the United States and Canada, and certainly at ICAO, as well as hear from the airlines and ALPA, of course. So let's go ahead and begin. Sir, please state your name and the organization you represent, please.
Yes, my name is Rich Krutenot. I'm the training chairman for American Eagle Airlines. My question is for Ms. Gilligan, and I very much appreciate the FAA's high-level priorities for safety and voluntary safety programs. We're very excited to launch a AQP program at our airline. However, we have met sort of a roadblock at our local FAA level where I believe our local FAA officials feel a mandate in the post-Colgan era, if you will. They believe they may have a mandate from the OIG to bring a more get-tough approach to enforcement and oversight. And frankly, it seems to be kind of dissonant in our attempt to move forward to a more open-minded, inclusive, collaborative approach to safety. It sort of seems like the approach is more to shoot your wounded rather than to bring them up and move forward towards safer cockpits. My passion is training, and I think that's where the link comes from high-level priorities to the cockpit is through training. And my question is, where would a guy like me begin to see if we can reshape the thinking on the local level, because we can't seem to quite get out of our local problem there, the roadblock there.
So I'm not particularly familiar with what the roadblock might be there. So let me say a couple of general things. First of all, I think, as you know, for AQP, we have a national office that sets the national policy for AQP and is always involved in the review and approval of AQP programs. So it may be necessary for you or someone from the airline or both to reach out to the national level if you think somehow the policies that should be applied to the AQP approval and oversight process aren't being followed. And we have a process for doing that within the agency to elevate those kinds of issues, because it is not uncommon for safety professionals to disagree on things and for an inspector or an engineer at a local level to perhaps have a different perspective, or perhaps at the national level we can see more flexibility in the policy and help to get all the parties to an agreement. So you may want to consider that. In terms of enforcement generally, it is always a balance that we struggle, quite honestly, sometimes to hit. We are very clear at the national level that enforcement is one tool, but just one tool in the toolkit for enhancing aviation safety. And I think broadly throughout the system, most of our inspectors, quite honestly, see that just as one of the many tools that they have. I just met yesterday with a class of our new employees, folks who have been with us somewhere between 1 year and 2 years. And almost to a person, the inspectors there came, first of all, from the industry themselves and are very much involved with their certificate holders in working together to enhance safety. So if you'd like to speak for a minute afterward and perhaps give me some more specifics, I'll be glad to see if I can help you in the specific circumstance. But I think whatever your experience is, you perhaps are broadening beyond what I think is really happening in the system more broadly.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, very good. Let's go over this side. Ma'am.
Good morning. I'm Christine Collins, and I'm the National President of the Union of Canadian Transportation Employees. And my questions are directed to Martin Eley. And you referenced in your presentation Parliament putting a halt on further SMS, and that was done through Minister Baird in 2009. Following extensive consultation through parliamentary committees. You further stated that you're now moving forward with SMS, and you're now at the stage where you're prepared to move forward. Issues and concerns we've raised throughout the implementation of SMS, and our position remains the same, that it must be an additional layer of safety and not a replacement layer to the roles and responsibility that Transport Canada has in oversight and inspection. You did not mention this morning how you're moving forward with SMS and whether it will be an additional layer or a replacement layer. And I find it very interesting that the first we are told of this moving forward with SMS is through this ALPA international conference. So I would like to ask you specifically how you're moving forward with SMS.
Okay. Thank you, Christine. A couple of bits of clarification. The decision to stop moving forward on SMS was taken at my level based on concerns at a more senior level, so there was no direction to stop. We took a look at it and realized there were some things that we need to resolve before we move forward. We have not yet made a decision to move forward. What we are doing is looking at those things in today's context. We've made a lot of progress, we believe, in a lot of areas. Part of that is the action plan that I think you're familiar with. We talked about it in there that we would be doing an assessment of the conditions under which we're ready to move forward again. Once we identify those conditions, we will be communicating them. So if I was misleading this morning, I apologize, but the intent is to move towards moving forward in a structured way. So that decision hasn't yet been made.
A follow-up question, if I may. Has the decision been made whether it's a replacement layer or an additional layer to the roles and responsibilities of Transport Canada?
There's no change there at all. The way we currently have SMS set up It's in addition to all the existing requirements. That continues to be the case, and that will be the case moving forward.
Thank you. Captain Shills.
Hi, I'm Mike Shills. I'm the Director of Safety Information and Analysis Programs here at ALPA. I'm also on the Issues and Analysis team for ICAO. Thank you all for coming. I have one favor to ask and then a question, and I'll ask the favor first just in case you don't like the question. The favor is for Peggy and Tom. If you could emphasize to our industry partners at the airlines how important it is that they include the pilots in their FOCA programs. We still have FOCA programs that we deal with where ALPA is excluded. Now, I realize the FAA can't force airlines to do that, but Peggy, I've known you for 4 years and you're pretty influential, and if you could make that point to them, I'd appreciate it. Tom, I know you were here representing the airlines, so if you could pass that message along, I'd appreciate it. Peggy, here's my question. I've had the honor of being on ICAO for 4 years. Do you ever see a time where we're able to either include international carriers or start a process like ICAO on an ICAO level type of industry?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, Mike. I think we all are seeing the value that we get from the integration of data, and it's got to be helpful to be able to do that at an international level. We've taken some baby steps along that path. I think you probably know we've had a request from the Latin American safety group to share some data, and we have been able to agree to do that. And so what they do is actually ask us for an analysis. We don't give them the raw data, but we do give them an analysis of activities that we are seeing or our operators are seeing at certain airports in Central and South America so that they can incorporate that into their analysis. We actually have an agreement up at ICAO with EASA and IATA, ICAO and the FAA, to look at how we might start to integrate some of those data sources as well. There are a lot of legal limitations. I think you know that. There are an awful lot of countries where the kind of protection, for example, that we are able to afford the data in the US is not in place yet, and in some locations it may never be able to be put in place. So we're always going to be balancing the protection element that is so important to the underpinnings of the program with how we can better integrate data around the world so that we can be sure we're getting the broadest picture. I think it's going to be a series of baby steps as we figure out who we can share with, as we see what we can learn from that, and then we can share those lessons more broadly. But I think we're definitely walking down that path.
Great. Thank you very much.
I don't know, Mitch, you may want to comment, Mitch, on the ICAO partnership agreement.
Well, we're very grateful to the FAA as regards the initiative in Latin America in sharing some information, de-identified information. It's very important for many of the airports in Latin America that are quite challenging to take a look at the data and some of the possible mitigating measures that could be taken. Yes, I see some expansion in the future of the sharing of safety information. We have the agreement in place as it pertains to many, many countries around the world. The sharing of safety information is not always very easy. It can be quite challenging. You're talking about different legal frameworks and different philosophies. So we're trying to influence that, and certainly we're trying to move forward in the guidance that we give to states on the protection of safety information, but we have a lot of work to do.
Thank you. Captain Landry.
Yes, Dennis Landry with Delta, formerly with Northwest. First, I'd like to congratulate the Canadians on the creation and adoption of a very successful winter operations friction measurement program known as CURFI. A number of years ago, I was the director of, or Special Projects Committee chairman at Northwest ALPA, and that was one of our big problems was airplanes off the runway. During my efforts, the FAA had somehow convinced most airports to begin reporting mu values, and we were quite successful for a while. But I've noticed in the last year or two that frequency of mu value reporting has been fewer and fewer, and right now seldom can I find a mu value report unless my company has specifically required the airport to deliver that information. Now, what I understand is the engineers have perhaps decided it's not entirely reliable, but mu value reporting is an important tool to the pilots, and I'd like to know if perhaps the FAA has any more ongoing efforts to add this information back into our toolbox. And again, what the Canadians have done up there has proved to be an incredibly valuable tool in our toolbox for safe operations. So I'd ask the FAA if perhaps they might comment on that, and I realize this is a cold question for you, so it's difficult. And if not, I can live with, I'll take that back to see why this particular tool is not readily available during winter operations. Thank you.
Sure. I think you're right. There is some disagreement about just how valuable mu values really are, both within FAA and within the community. So it's an airport program responsibility whether to collect mu values. It's not a requirement for the airport in order to hold its certification. But I will take the question back to our airports division to see if there's any particular work being done either on encouraging mu value reporting or looking at some alternatives. I'm sure you're all aware there's a lot of technology alternatives that are being looked into. I guess there's a certain amount of research work being done to try to find a way to measure friction that may be more effective than the mu value. But I'll be glad to get something back through Chuck or other folks here at ALPA to get you a direct answer. Sure.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Sir.
Hi, Bill Secord with FedEx Express. I wanted to start by thanking the FAA for the science-based approach that you took to Part 117. I think it was a good process. The Aviation Rulemaking Committee did a good job. The process was sound right up to the point where the Office of Management and Budget cut cargo carriers out because of what they said was the cost significantly outweigh the societal benefits. The science supports the fact that cargo pilots fatigue the same as passenger pilots. The FAA felt compelled to include cargo carriers in the original rulemaking. So I guess my question is, how do we justify the thought process that cost is more important than safety, and how do you feel that, how can we remedy that?
Well, as I said even in my opening remarks, I think it is important that we understand what the costs and benefits of any of the rules that we put forward will be so that society understands that. And I think in this case, as in so many cases, we're going to have to look for other ways to try to address the risk. That's why we're very encouraged that the fatigue risk management plans, for example, are already in place at all of the cargo carriers. And we're going to continue to use that as a tool to work with the cargo carriers to make sure that they're looking at how the science, that, as we understand it now, applies to the schedules they're putting together, and that within their plan, they are training pilots on what the fatigue risks are in those schedules, how the pilot might manage it, and to actually be changing their schedules when they identify a level of risk that we and they find to be unacceptable. So the outcome for the rulemaking, I think, at this point is what it is. We'll see where the litigation goes, and that may change some outcomes. We need to see how that goes. But what I think is more important is there are lots of ways to skin this cat, and we're going to continue within the FAA to pursue all those other alternatives, working with the cargo operators and with ALPA and the pilots to make sure that the risk is reduced within the structure, within the regulatory structure that we have now.
As a follow-up, you mentioned fatigue risk management system. I think that's a great part of of Part 117. I think it makes the rule flexible, which is really what we need. But you mentioned we need to look in other directions of how to deal with the risk. The science supports the fact that the risk is the same regardless of what you're carrying in the airplane. So really, we basically cut out for cost. So how do we justify that just solely on cost when the risk is the same?
So again, I think the best I can tell you is that the analysis does require that we identify what the particular costs are to different segments of the industry against the benefits to that particular segment of the industry. And what we're facing now is a challenge for how to mitigate that risk using other tools besides rulemaking. And I think we've got a good path with the statutory requirement to have fatigue risk management plans. We've got a good path where FAA, working with the industry, can make sure the risk is being reduced, whether under that regulation or in this case, under the fatigue risk planning that they're required to do.
Captain Noy.
Ms. Gilligan.
There's lots of folks on this panel.
I know. I do have a question for you, and
okay.
embedded in the question is probably another request for a favor. So my name is...
Well, according to Mike, I'm real effective, so go ahead.
I suspect you are, honestly. So my name is Lee Genoy. I'm the Central Air Safety Chair for Mesa Airlines and the National Training Chair. And while I tremendously appreciate our relationship together on the national level, my question is what can we all do to facilitate that relationship at the CMO level?
I'm not sure I completely understand. Maybe I do, I'm sorry, this has come up before. I guess I do understand that ALPA doesn't, or the local MEC doesn't have a direct relationship with the CMO, because obviously we deal with the organization that holds our certificates. But having said that, I do think many of the CMOs, especially as a result of the ASAP programs, have seen value, and well, I guess all three of the parties have seen value in having all three of the players at the table for addressing certain issues. So I guess the best I could advise is continue to reach out. I do think our inspectors understand that their regulatory link is to the operator. Obviously, it's to you guys because you hold particular certificates in a different way, but in terms of the organization of the airline, that's our certificate link and that's our regulatory link. But I don't think it's anybody's intention to exclude anybody from the conversation. So I would just encourage you to continue to reach out and offer what you can to assist in helping to address the safety concerns. Obviously, it's helpful if your operator brings you to the table as well. I don't think it's reasonable to expect that FAA is going to be able to bring the MEC in if the operator isn't embracing you as well. So it's important to have that working relationship on the safety issues, fully understanding there will always be industrial issues, and you two guys have to work that out. But on the safety side, we would certainly encourage operators to include all of their union representatives as we try to solve safety problems.
We'll continue to try to build those relationships, and I thank you for your help in assisting us as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hello, it's Captain Barry Wisniewski. I'm the chairman of the Flight Safety Division for the Air Canada Pilots Association. A couple questions here.
Feel free to ask Martin, okay?
Ask Martin? Well, actually, I really, one of the things that we have in Canada is we lack the protection of voluntary safety reporting. Right now in Canada, the Labour Code trumps the Aeronautics Act, so when a pilot fills out an ASAP or an ASR report, it becomes a company document, and that can be discovered by another organization that wants to find out what the pilot was doing. So Martin and I talked earlier about that, but thanks, Peggy, for that. And I'd really like to pursue Canada having protection for the voluntary safety reporting. But Martin mentioned earlier the increased collaboration in doing a risk assessment and moving on forward on how we're going to address SMS in Canada. And I'd like to know, do you see the professional pilot organizations, ALPA, ACPA, the WestJet Pilot Associations, others, as being stakeholders in that risk assessment process?
Yes, Barry, I'm not sure if I know the answer to that yet. I know there's a lot of information being gathered. In our risk assessment process, we always have the ability to bring in people with technical expertise. I'm honestly not sure what the plan is at the moment. I will add one comment, though. One of the things that we learned along the way in terms of dealing with looking at the flight and duty times and moving towards fatigue risk management systems, when you get into some of these smaller operators, the pilots don't have a voice in the sense, we can deal with the large airlines, whether we're dealing with ACPA or ALPA, we have that ability to do that. When you get into smaller operators, that they don't have any voice. So we get the operator side of the picture in the sense of, their concerns they have about flight duty times in sort of bush operations in the extreme case, if you like. but we don't have a way to communicate with the pilots. So, you know, and the same sort of thing applies in SMS. When we get into those smaller groups, you know, some of the associations, ATAC, for example, is starting to work with the smaller operators and the other provincial associations, but we don't always have a common voice. So we try very hard to make sure we get the balance between the heavy metal, if you like, and the other end of the spectrum, which is sort of where we're going in terms of SMS more than where we've been.
But I think that you find in Canada, the majority of the pilots, I flew in so far north we had to come out to hunt. So, you know, the guys that are flying the big airplanes have flown the small airplanes, they've been there, they know what's going on. But basically then what I'm asking you, are the pilot associations and the professional pilots stakeholders in the SMS system?
You're clearly stakeholders. I just don't know the specific answer about the plans for the risk assessment. I can ask that question when I get back home and let you know, Barry.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We have time for one more question. Sir.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Ken Pasker. I'm president of AF Team, an aviation consulting group based in New York City. And I'm sorry, Ms. Gilligan, but this question is for you too. I apologize.
It happens to me all the time.
While I've been sitting here listening to this wonderful panel, some of the questions that I've heard raise an issue in my head that I'd like to ask you about, if you don't mind. And while ALPA is doing a stellar job in promoting both security and the culture, promoting both safety and the culture of safety, there's a perception, whether it's real or perceived, that the FAA is becoming more and more a political entity, resulting in poor communications between the FAA and the private sector. To what extent can the FAA improve its reputation as a neutral entity that is solely concerned in keeping our flight crews and passengers safe?
Well, I'm not sure I would agree with you that there is the alternate perception, but what I can tell you is that, and I think the folks here will attest, FAA is deeply involved in working very closely with all the stakeholders on how we can continually enhance and improve safety. So things like the Commercial Aviation Safety Team, the Aviation Safety Information and Sharing Initiatives, all of those are part and parcel to FAA's accomplishing its mission. So I think that our safety record really demonstrates that we have worked well in consultation with the rest of the industry, both domestically and internationally. And I actually am not sure, as I said, that I share your sense that there is a perception that FAA isn't dealing it in a constructive way in terms of enhancing safety within the industry.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that it was not an accusation, it was just a perception that possibly perceived by some people.
I mean, I understand that, and the dilemma with perceptions is sometimes they're factually accurate and then you need to address that, and sometimes they're factually inaccurate and you have to be able to educate people to what the facts are. But again, I haven't actually heard I haven't heard a perception described as you just described it. And I think if one were to look at the facts, FAA is very closely involved with its stakeholders, working to enhance safety. So I think the facts sort of speak for themselves.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I think we'll cut it there. As you can see, the regulator's perspective does frame a lot of the work we do, a lot of the work from ICAO. It frames what we do in our safety work. So join me in a round of applause in thanking our panelists.